remember those 80s sitcoms? The ones that made you laugh, then left without the ending they deserved? These shows were part of our daily lives, shaping routines, friendships, even family dinners. Why did stories that meant so much end like they did? And why does it still bother us? Punky Brewster was never just a kid's show. It was about resilience and heart in a way that 1980s television rarely dared to explore. At its center was a little girl abandoned by her mother, taken in by a lonely older man, and determined to make her own version of family stick. Punky, played by Soleil Moon Frye, was fearless and funny, full of color and chaos, but she never lost her edge of sadness. She made it okay to be different. She made it okay to hurt, and still smile anyway. The early seasons struck a rare balance between sitcom sweetness and emotional depth. Punky was not just mischievous, she was navigating real fear. And Henry, her guardian, was not just grumpy. He was learning how to be vulnerable again. They grew together. You could feel it in every episode. When things got serious, when Punky's dog got sick, when Henry's photo studio burned down, the show did not flinch. It leaned into those moments and trusted kids to handle them. But then, just as the show found its voice, the network lost its nerve. After season 2, Punky Brewster was canceled. It returned in syndication, but it was not the same. The writing got broader. The episodes lost the weight that had made them special. What was once a show about growing through pain became a show about wacky inventions and cheesy after-school adventures. Punky stayed punky, but the world around her softened. Instead of tackling hard topics, the show started avoiding them. And that sense of emotional truth, the thing that made it matter, faded. The characters did not grow much. The stories stopped challenging us. It became cute when it used to be brave. By the time it ended in 1988, there was no finale. No resolution, just a quiet stop. Punky did not say goodbye. Henry did not reflect. We just moved on. Like the network had closed the book before the story was finished. Fans were left to imagine what came next. Did Punky grow up happy? Did she and Henry stay close? Did all that pain ever get processed? We will never know, because the show never gave us that chance. Punky Brewster deserved a final chapter. Not because it needed to wrap everything up neatly, but because it had earned the right to say something real at the end. Something bold, something honest. Instead, it ended mid-sentence, and the silence that followed still feels louder than it should. Silver Spoons was pure 1980s fantasy, but at its core, it was about something deeply human. A boy reuniting with the father he never knew, and a father learning how to become one, too. Edward Stratton III was a grown-up who never really grew up. Ricky was a kid forced to act like an adult for most of his life. And together, they tried to figure out what a real family looked like. Inside a mansion full of arcade games, model trains, and all the toys you never had. It was lighthearted, yes, but it had heart. And that mattered. Ricky Schroder's performance brought sincerity to every scene. He was not just playing a rich kid. He was trying to understand a world where money could buy comfort, but not love. And Joel Higgins, as Edward, matched him with warmth and charm that made even the wildest plot lines feel grounded. Whether it was dealing with school troubles, divorced parents, or teenage crushes, the show found a way to speak to something real beneath the laughs. But when Silver Spoons entered its later seasons, the balance began to shift. Ricky grew up. The storylines tried to follow. But the show was not ready to evolve with him. New characters were brought in. Romantic arcs were introduced. The tone got more serious, but not always more meaningful. The innocence that once made the show so comforting started to dissolve. It was clear they wanted to grow the show up, but forgot to grow it forward. The cast still worked. The chemistry was still there, but the storytelling lost focus. Episodes became scattered, caught between teen drama and family comedy. And the deeper emotional beats that once defined the show were left behind. It felt less like a journey and more like a slow drift. By the final season, Silver Spoons was airing in syndication. The original network had moved on. There was no build-up to an ending, no final arc, no closing moment where Ricky and Edward looked back at how far they had come. It just stopped. One last episode, and then gone. Which hurt, because the show had started with a question. Can two strangers become family? And by the end, we had earned an answer. But it never came. Silver Spoons deserved a better send-off. It had charm, heart, and a cast that cared. But it was never allowed to finish the story it started. And in the space where that ending should have been, all that remains is the echo of a laugh track that never got to fade out properly. Some sitcoms need closure. Silver Spoons needed gratitude, and it never got either. Webster began as a show about second chances, not just for its characters, but for its audience. It starred Emmanuel Lewis as Webster Long, a young African-American boy orphaned after a tragic accident and adopted by a newly married interracial couple. That premise alone broke ground in 1983. The show promised more than laughs. It promised heart, healing, and a new idea of what family could look like. And in those early seasons, it delivered. Webster was more than adorable. He was emotionally complex, curious, thoughtful, and full of questions that many adults were still trying to answer. George and Catherine Papadopoulos, played by Alex Karras and Susan Clark, brought real warmth to the show. Their love for Webster felt honest. Their growing pains as parents, especially in a blended and unexpected household, gave the series weight beyond the punchlines. Episodes tackled grief, identity, and the awkward truths of becoming a family after trauma. It was not perfect, but it meant something. But by the time Webster reached its later seasons, the edges began to dull. The plots got lighter. The conflicts got smaller, and the show, once willing to confront difficult moments, began to tiptoe around them. Instead of growing with Webster, the show tried to freeze him in place. Emmanuel Lewis never aged much physically, and producers leaned on that, keeping the tone childish long after the themes had moved on. The character's maturity was ignored, even when the actor behind him was clearly changing. The family story stopped evolving, and what began as a bold emotional journey started to feel like a rerun. Even the format began to shift. The family moved to a new apartment. Storylines became more episodic, less personal. Side characters took up more time, and the emotional core that once centered everything, that bond between Webster, George, and Catherine, started to blur. And then, just like that, it ended. No finale, no goodbye, no final conversation where Webster reflected on where he had been or where he was going. It simply stopped. The laughter cut off, the set went dark, and we were left with nothing but the memory of a show that once dared to feel. Webster deserved better. It deserved to honor its premise, to show us what happened when a family made from loss and love reached the next chapter. It had earned a chance to end on purpose, not just on schedule. Instead, it drifted away. And in doing so, it left a silence where a final word should have been. "Gimme a break" started with a powerful idea. Nell Carter as Nell Harper, a housekeeper stepping in to help a widowed police chief raise his 3 daughters. But from the very first episode, it was clear that this show was not going to be about traditional roles. Nell was not just a supporting character. She was the center. She was loud, funny, loving, and full of authority in a world that often refused to give her any. And for years, she held it all together. She brought warmth and humor to every moment. Whether she was cooking a meal, settling a fight, or offering the kind of advice no one else was brave enough to give, Nell Carter gave the role weight. And in doing so, she gave the series its heart. But Gimme a Break was a show that never quite knew when to stop reinventing itself. Characters came and went. The cast shifted again and again. The original daughters grew up. New kids moved in. Even the setting changed, from Glen Lawn to New York City. And while Nell remained the glue, the pieces around her started to feel like they belonged to different puzzles entirely. The show never found a second identity to match its first. Instead of growing deeper, it just kept growing wider. Nell deserved better writing, better support, and better closure. Instead, the emotional core was chipped away by constant shakeups. What started as a heartfelt sitcom became something unrecognizable by the final season. The original cast had a lived-in bond that no rewrite could replace. When the daughters disappeared, it was like ripping out pages from a book and pretending the story still made sense. Nell's most meaningful relationships were replaced with flat characters and sitcom filler. The show had energy, but no direction, momentum, but no map. You could feel Nell Carter carrying the weight of the entire series by herself. She never let the audience feel the drop in quality, but you could see it in her eyes. There were still good moments, but they were buried in noise. By the final season, it was not the same show, and Nell deserved better than to fade out with it. The move to New York should have been a fresh chapter, but instead, it made the show feel even more lost. The charm of the family home was gone. The dynamic with the daughters faded. The rhythm never returned. And viewers, once loyal, began to drift away. Nell Carter still gave everything. Every scene, every punchline, every hug. She never phoned it in. But the show did not match her. By its final episodes, Gimme a Break was a shell of what it once was. And then it ended. Not with resolution, but with exhaustion. No proper send-off for Nell. No real farewell to the family that had been built over 6 seasons. Just a quiet exit. A closing credit that came too soon and far too empty. Gimme a Break deserved a final moment that felt like a celebration of Nell, of love, of endurance. Instead, it ended with questions. And the biggest one of all, why did they let it fall apart when it had already built so much? Because some shows do not just deserve a finale, they deserve gratitude. Charles in Charge was a show that knew exactly what it wanted to be, light, charming, and just sentimental enough to keep your heart warmed between the laughs. The setup was simple. A college student, Charles, takes on a live-in job helping out a suburban family and somehow ends up being the glue that holds everything together. He was the big brother, the babysitter, the fixer. And with Scott Baio's calm delivery and knowing smile, he made it all feel effortless. It was the kind of 1980s sitcom you could drop into at any point and still know what was going on. And yet, it never really got the ending it earned. The original version of the show only lasted 1 season. The Pembrokes, the first family Charles worked for, quietly disappeared. No farewell, no transition. Just a different family, the Powells, and a slightly adjusted tone. The switch was jarring for some viewers, but others stuck with it. Charles was still Charles. Buddy Lembeck was still the lovable mess of a sidekick. The house was the same. The theme song still promised that Charles in charge of our days and our nights. But something had shifted. What was once fresh started to feel frozen. The stories got broader, the jokes got louder, and character growth gave way to comfort. Charles stayed in charge, but nobody ever asked if he wanted to be. He helped everyone else grow up, but never seemed to get the same chance. And for a show about someone who changed lives, Charles himself stayed oddly stuck. Week after week, he solved problems without ever really facing his own. His college life, his ambitions, his relationships, they all existed off-screen. We never saw what Charles wanted beyond the walls of that house. Every time he got close to change, the reset button was hit. Buddy evolved more than Charles, and he was the comic relief. There were flashes of growth, hints that Charles might move on, but they always faded by the next episode. The show became static, and Charles became a symbol of arrested development wrapped in a smile. He deserved a journey, not just a job. Over time, the show leaned more on formula. Misunderstandings, crushes, school dances gone wrong, the occasional lesson wrapped in a fast apology and a laugh track. It was harmless, and for many families, that was enough. But underneath, there was something missing. Charles never really found a path of his own. He lived in someone else's home, took care of someone else's kids, gave advice like a parent, but had none of the grounding that comes with being one. And the show never seemed interested in exploring who Charles really was outside of being the guy who fixed everyone else's problems. And then, like that, the show ended. No graduation, no goodbye, no real final word. It just faded away. The last episode aired like any other. A self-contained plot, a few laughs, a quick wrap-up. But there was no resolution, no future to imagine. That was the real heartbreak. Because Charles in Charge had the bones of something more. It could have been a story about growing into adulthood while helping others do the same. It could have shown us what it means to outgrow the role you are given and choose the one you want. Instead, it stayed safe. And safe, for all its comfort, is rarely remembered. Charles deserved a moment to look back, to say goodbye, to reflect on what he had built and what he had missed. But television moved on, and Charles stayed in that house, forever in charge of everyone but himself. And somehow, that quiet non-ending says more than the show ever meant to. The Hogan Family is a show that never quite got its own identity, because by the time it figured itself out, it was already too far down the road. Originally launched as Valerie, the series was meant to center around Valerie Harper as the mom of 3 boys, juggling career and parenthood while trying to keep a household together. Harper brought credibility, warmth, and sharp comic timing. But behind the scenes, things were tense. Salary disputes, creative disagreements, and before the show could really settle in, she was gone. Literally written out. Her character was killed off between seasons. In her place came Sandy Duncan as the boys' aunt, and the show was rebranded. First as Valerie's Family, then finally the Hogan Family. And while Duncan brought her own charm, a lighter, more sitcom-friendly energy, the loss of Harper left a gap that never quite closed. From that point on, the show felt like it was rebuilding on uneven ground. It had likable characters, but they never quite felt part of the same original world. Plots leaned into safe family hijinks, and emotional threads were often cut short. The shift in tone, from real and grounded to goofy and cheerful, made it harder to invest. It was a show in constant identity crisis, and yet it survived. Thanks to a solid cast, including Jason Bateman, who even then had a knack for delivering dry humor with heart, the show stayed afloat. People kept watching. The kids grew up, the house stayed chaotic, and the writing slowly found rhythm again. But the deeper story, the family recovering from loss, the shifting roles, the way grief reshapes relationships, was never explored. It was swept under the rug, left behind with Valerie. You never saw the family sit down and talk about what her absence meant. There was no moment of reckoning, no episode where they truly stopped to feel it. Instead, the show pressed on with birthday parties, school dances, and sitcom misunderstandings. Even the relationships between the brothers felt less lived in and more scripted as time passed. Bateman carried much of the later years, but even he could only do so much. The show had become a weekly habit rather than something you looked forward to. It never failed, but it never surprised you again either. And in that sameness, it quietly let go of what made it special. As the seasons wore on, the Hogan family leaned more into episodic misadventures. A school prank here, a dating disaster there, holiday specials, sleepover shenanigans, the usual sitcom fare. It was comforting, but it was shallow. By the time it reached its final season in 1991, the show was coasting. The youngest son became the center of attention. Older characters got less and less screen time. There was no build-up, no long arc to wrap things up. And when the final episode aired, it felt like just another week, not the end of a 5-year story. No montage, no final family dinner, no reflection, just credits. Which was a shame, because the Hogan family had gone through something rare on television. It had survived a major upheaval, rebuilt itself, and kept going. And for that alone, it deserved a moment to breathe at the end, a way to honor the beginning, acknowledge the loss, and give viewers a real goodbye. Instead, it ended like a door closing behind you when you did not realize it was the last time you would walk through it. The Hogan family deserved a better ending, not just for the cast or the fans, but for the story it had started, then quietly stopped telling. And in that silence, it joins the list of sitcoms that once had something to say and never got the last word. Head of the Class was always a different kind of sitcom. It was not about slackers or rebels, it was about overachievers. The setting was simple: a gifted program at a Manhattan high school filled with students who were too smart for their age, too quirky for the mainstream, and too restless to be ignored. At the center was Charlie Moore, played by Howard Hesseman, a laid-back history teacher with a passion for life outside textbooks. He did not teach from a podium. He taught by listening, challenging, and caring. The cast was a mix of personalities: the brain, the jock, the artist, the nerd, the future politician, and somehow it worked. It was not flashy, but it was thoughtful. It was not always laugh-out-loud funny, but it made you smile, and occasionally made you think. In a sea of family sitcoms, Head of the Class stood out because it asked what happens when a classroom becomes a place to grow, not just perform. But like so many shows that quietly do things right, it did not get the ending it earned. The crack started when Howard Hesseman left the show in the final season. His replacement, Billy Connolly as Mr. McGregor, brought a different kind of energy, more frantic, less grounded. He was funny, sure, but the heart of the show shifted. The bond between Charlie and the kids had always been the emotional core. Without him, it felt like a different class entirely. It was not just a new teacher, it was a new tone. The stories lost their emotional weight, trading quiet insights for louder gags. The students, once complex and evolving, became flatter, stuck in tropes they had already outgrown. Episodes felt more like standalone sketches than the next chapter in a meaningful journey. And that classroom, once alive with potential, started to feel like just another set. It stopped being about who the students were becoming and focused only on what they were doing that week. The show traded real arcs for recycled plots. There was no more curiosity, no more challenge, no more push to think differently. The cast still had talent, but the stories no longer asked them to stretch. The audience had grown with the characters, but the show left them behind. You could feel the intelligence fade from the scripts, replaced by louder, simpler jokes. It had once been a series about potential. Now it was just keeping the lights on. And the spark that once made it unique flickered out quietly. The final season tried, but it never found its rhythm. Characters graduated off-screen, relationships dissolved without explanation. What had once been a series that respected its audience's intelligence had started playing for safer laughs. There was no series finale, no final test, no reflective goodbye, no moment where the teacher looked back at how far his students had come. It just stopped. No closure for Arvid or Darlene. No curtain call for Simone, Dennis, or Eric. Just a quiet fade into syndication, as if the bell rang one last time and no one bothered to say it out loud. And that is what makes its ending so frustrating. Because Head of the Class deserved to be remembered not just as a clever school comedy, but as a show that quietly told kids it was okay to be brilliant, awkward, or weird. It gave the spotlight to the students who usually sat in the back row of every other sitcom. But instead of letting them graduate on their own terms, the show shuffled them out the side door. Head of the Class deserved a final lesson, not in history or politics or Shakespeare, but in how to end something with care. Instead, it left the chalkboard half erased, and the class and the audience never got to say goodbye. Too Close for Comfort was the kind of sitcom that crept into your living room and stayed longer than you expected. Comfortable, familiar, and just odd enough to stand out. It revolved around Henry Rush, a grumpy cartoonist played by Ted Knight, his wife Muriel, and their two grown daughters who, much to Henry's dismay, lived downstairs in the same San Francisco house. It was a premise built on friction. A man used to control, now sharing space with two fiercely independent young women. In the early seasons, the humor worked. Henry's stubbornness played well against the changing times. His daughters, Jackie and Sarah, were smart, sarcastic, and just wild enough to keep the house unpredictable. Muriel was the voice of reason, balancing the chaos with calm insight and warmth. And Ted Knight? He made it all click. His timing, his delivery, even his eye rolls, they carried the show in ways most leads could not. But behind the laughs, the show started wobbling early. Midway through its run, it went into first-run syndication, which meant budget cuts, cast changes, and creative detours. And that is when the identity of the show started to shift. Characters came and went with little explanation. Daughter Sarah was written out completely, replaced with a new lodger named Monroe, a well-meaning oddball who somehow became the show's new comedic anchor. And while Jim J. Bullock was genuinely funny, it felt like the writers were building a new house on the ruins of the old one. The family chemistry that had grounded the series was gone, and the Rush household became more cartoon than character. Plots got broader, the gags got louder, and the grounded family dynamics gave way to zany situations and sitcom tropes. Henry Rush, once a grumbling but believable dad, became a walking punchline, often removed from the heart of the story entirely. And then tragedy struck. In 1986, Ted Knight passed away unexpectedly. The show tried to carry on under a new title, The Ted Knight Show, repackaged with a slight shift in setting and tone. But without Henry, there was no Too Close for Comfort. The reruns may have kept airing, but the soul of the series had already left the room. It never got a proper send-off, no finale, no chance to honor Henry Rush as the father, the cartoonist, the man at the center of it all. Just silence. And that silence feels heavier when you remember how much laughter came before it. Because Too Close for Comfort started as a show about a changing family and how difficult and hilarious it can be to let go. But in the end, it was the show itself that was never allowed to let go with grace. It should have ended with a final look at that house on the hill. One last awkward hug. One last lesson disguised as a punchline. But television moved on. And the family we had spent years watching never got to say goodbye. Bosom Buddies had a premise so absurd it should not have worked. Two guys, Kip and Henry, need affordable housing in New York City, but the only place they can find is a women-only apartment building. So, naturally, they dress as women, every day, for years. It was a setup built for gags, but what made it last, even for just 2 seasons, was how much heart it had behind the wigs. At the center of it all were Tom Hanks and Peter Scolari, 2 actors whose chemistry was so seamless it made the ridiculous premise believable. You rooted for them, even when you probably should not have. Kip and Henry were immature, chaotic, full of lies, and yet lovable. Their friendship was the real story, and that is what gave the show its charm. It was about pretending and slowly realizing you could not pretend your way through growing up. In the beginning, it was fast-paced, clever, and carried by its cast. Holland Taylor, Wendy Jo Sperber, Donna Dixon, every character brought something sharp to the table. The show played with gender norms, identity, and ambition, even if it never took itself too seriously. It had something to say, even when it was dressed like a joke. But Bosom Buddies was always walking a tightrope, and eventually, it slipped. The gimmick wore thin, fast. Viewers stopped tuning in for the disguises and started caring more about the relationships, but the show never fully leaned into that shift. By the second season, the wigs were mostly off, and the series was trying to find its real voice. It got closer, focusing more on the friendships, the workplace comedy, and the growing feelings between Kip and Sonny. But it never got the chance to finish becoming what it was trying to be. ABC pulled the plug after season 2, and just like that, it was over. No closure, no finale, no final scene where Kip confesses his love or Henry gets serious about writing. No final laugh between best friends who had carried every single episode on their backs. It was just gone. A funny, strange, heartfelt little show that never got to grow into itself. And for fans who came to love the characters underneath the wigs, the ending felt more like a cancellation than a goodbye. What hurts most is knowing how close it was to becoming something great, because it had already stopped being about the joke. It had become a story about 2 friends trying to figure out their lives in a city that did not make it easy. It was about finding yourself, even if you had to put on a costume to do it. And in that way, Bosom Buddies deserved the space to take the disguise off and tell us what came next. Instead, we are left with reruns and what-ifs. 2 seasons of charm and potential cut short before the real punchline could land. It was silly, it was sincere, and it deserved a better ending. Small Wonder was one of those shows that felt like it should have been a Saturday morning cartoon, but somehow aired in prime time. The story of a robotics engineer who secretly creates a human-looking android named Vicky and raises her as part of the family was strange even by 1980s standards. But week after week, people tuned in. Maybe it was the robotic monotone, maybe it was the laugh track, maybe it was just the kind of weird you could not look away from. Whatever it was, Small Wonder carved out its place in television history, for better or worse. Vicky was not just the center of the show, she was the reason the show existed. Tiffany Brissett played her with robotic stillness, blinking just the right amount, tilting her head with perfect, unnatural precision. The gimmick was strong. A robot trying to live like a real girl, it had potential for both laughs and quiet moments. And every now and then, it even delivered on both. The family, Ted, Joan, and Jamie, was painted in broad strokes, but they were reliable. The annoying neighbor, Harriet, was a classic 1980s sitcom sidekick, loud, nosy, and always missing the bigger picture. And somehow, it all worked. Not because it was realistic, but because it knew it was not. But the further Small Wonder went, the more it leaned into its oddness and away from its promise. The show never changed gears, even when it desperately needed to. Vicky never evolved beyond the original programming, emotionally or narratively. She remained a plot device with pigtails, even as the world around her begged for something deeper. The supporting characters stayed frozen, the jokes got broader, and the themes never matured. And what started as a clever idea turned into a running gag with no punchline. By season 4, Small Wonder was clearly out of steam. The stories had grown repetitive, the performances were locked in place, and worst of all, the central idea, a robot learning to become human, never actually went anywhere. Vicky did not grow. She did not question her identity. She did not take even one step toward becoming real. She just vacuumed rooms in 2 seconds and gave deadpan one-liners while everyone smiled. And then the show ended, with no goodbye. No series finale, no big reveal, no Vicky is discovered storyline, no what happens when she outgrows the family moment. Just a final episode like any other, where nothing much changed and nothing much mattered. And for a show built on the question, what if a machine became family? That feels like a betrayal of its own premise. Small Wonder could have said something about technology, about identity, about growing up in a world that does not always make sense. But it never tried. It stayed cute. It stayed safe. And eventually, it just stopped. No send-off, no growth, no wonder. It is remembered now mostly as a curiosity, a relic of an era that loved big ideas and small budgets. But for those who watched it weekly, who believed there might be something underneath the surface, its ending still feels like a missed opportunity. Because even the weirdest stories deserve a real conclusion. Which of these sitcoms left you wishing for just one more scene? Let us know in the comments. Tap like if you still think about the endings that never came, and subscribe so you never miss the stories behind the shows that deserved more than just a fade to black.